Hello and welcome to this webinar on how artificial intelligence can help us to tackle climate change. Bonjour et bienvenue à ce webinaire sur le rôle de l'intelligence artificielle dans la lutte contre le changement climatique. I'm Chloe Adams, the British Consul General in Montreal, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the UK's High Commissioner to Canada, Susan Lejeune-Alguerchec, to give opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chloé, et bonjour à tout le monde. Moi, je suis ravie aussi d'assister à ce webinaire aujourd'hui. Et je voudrais commencer par remercier and to say thank you to our partner in this event today, McGill University and MILA, particularly in the form of Dr. David Rolnick, who has been instrumental in putting it together. So thank you so much, David, for all your help in getting us to this point today. And it's great to see so many people taking part in the webinar today. I'd also like to thank our brilliant panelists who will give you a really insightful and thought-provoking presentation after I've just briefly introduced the subject matter of today's webinar. This event brings together two of my team's most important priorities for this year. The first is obviously climate change as the UK takes on the presidency of the COP26 conference, which is to take place in Glasgow in November, but also artificial intelligence. Yesterday, the government published its integrated review of foreign, defence, security and development policy. And what it made very clear was that climate change was the #1 foreign policy priority that we are dealing with at the moment. That is because it is an area in which every single country in the world has an interest. Every single country in the world is impacted, but also it's not something we can tackle on our own. And the second reason why the integrated review is relevant today is that it talks in great detail about science and technology as being at the heart of the UK's international posture. And I'm really pleased that the team here in Canada, but particularly the team in Montreal, has done a huge amount of work on artificial intelligence and has great collaboration with local experts such as David and others in examining how the UK and Canada can work together to harness artificial intelligence to the benefit of our populations and for the planet in general, but also to make sure that we regulate and we develop norms for what is an exciting, but also potentially in the wrong hands, quite a dangerous technology or set of technologies. AI is going to be absolutely crucial to the fight against climate change. It has impacts in agriculture, it has impacts in energy, it has impacts in transport, and it has also impacts in disaster preparedness and preparation and management of disasters. So none of that, however, would be possible without really intense collaboration and cooperation. And the collaboration and cooperation between the UK and Canada in this field is brilliant. There's even more we can do together. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our experts today, their perspectives on the potential for further work, the challenges that are facing us, and how we can work together to tackle those challenges. Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Now, we are fortunate to have an excellent panel with us here today. So let me introduce them. Panelists, please could you turn on your cameras? We have David Rolnick, who is Assistant Professor and Canada CFAR AI Chair in the School of Computer Science at McGill University and at MILA, the Quebec AI Institute. He's co-founder and chair of Climate Change AI and scientific co-director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. Hello, David. Next, we have Jay Ashton Butler, who is Head of AI Leadership in the UK Government's Office for Artificial Intelligence. The Office for AI is responsible for developing the recently announced National AI Strategy, where Jay is leading on the intersection between AI and net zero. He also has years of experience working for the UK government on energy policy. Welcome, Jay. Next, we have Éliane Ubalijoro, who is Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and the Global Hub Director in Canada for Future Earth. She's Professor of Practice for Public-Private Sector Partnerships at McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development. Welcome, Éliane. And finally, we have Paul Massara of the Centre for AI and Climate Change, also joining us from the UK. Paul holds a number of non-executive roles, including the chair of Sovereign Housing and board advisor to various energy tech startups. He's a member of the UK government's Committee on Fuel Poverty and works with the Said Business School at Oxford University on their Creative Destruction Lab. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. So let's get straight to the substance, and we'll start with a general question that I'm going to ask all of you to respond to. Simply, how can AI help us to tackle climate change? Let's start with David.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let's maybe start first with a definition of AI. It's a very broad term and it gets thrown around a lot. It basically just means any computer algorithm that can perform a complex task, where complex is definitely something that one can discuss. But particularly in recent years, it's meant a particular kind of AI called machine learning, which learns to extract patterns from data. Machine learning is good at doing fairly simple things like labeling pictures or identifying multivariable relationships very fast, though it generally needs large amounts of data to work, and it's very sensitive to inaccuracies or biases in that data. Machine learning is a very powerful and broadly applicable tool, and it's the reason why AI is now being used in applications from speech recognition to medical imagery, and really across society. And like other really powerful enabling technologies, we can use it to accelerate many different things, both good and bad. And it turns out that there are many bottlenecks within climate change strategies, mitigation, adaptation, climate science that really benefit from machine learning. Applications in power systems, transportation, energy, industry, land use, climate and weather prediction, and disaster response. And all of those I know we'll go into in more detail later on, so I'll leave further details. But in each of these cases, it's really important to understand that machine learning and AI are only one piece of the puzzle, and using them requires partnership between experts in AI and experts in other fields, and also the stakeholders who are using the technology and the communities that are most affected by it. I'll leave it at that for now, but I look forward to delving into more aspects of this.
Thank you, David, for kicking us off. Éliane, why don't you go next?
So let's just think of one area that interests us all: food. We all eat. And what we know is that every year, 9 million people die of hunger every year. And we have over 800 million people who live in hunger every day, and over 3 billion who live in food insecurity. So David was talking about the power of algorithms, and so data feeding those algorithms. What we know, for example, is that for the global poor, mostly in the global south, when smallholder farmers have access to data and that they have access to insights that AI can drive, they can increase their productivity by 30% easily and their livelihoods. And at the same time, they can also decrease their footprint in terms of the agricultural effect on greenhouse gas emissions. So what we know is that the insights that AI can allow us to bring to all fields can really empower us in terms of mitigation strategies as well as adaptation strategies. And those are critical to everything we do. And so the more we're able to take all the data that's available and, thanks to AI, be able to drive those into mitigation and adaptation strategies, then we really have a winning chance of really tackling climate change effectively.
Thank you, Éliane. Paul, what are your general thoughts on how AI can help tackle climate change?
So I guess building on what's been said, I think I'd add a couple of things. One is I look at AI and say that essentially what it does is it uses computing power to reduce the cost of prediction. And when you reduce the cost of prediction, many issues that previously weren't prediction issues become prediction issues. So I'll give you an example. In the past, when we drove a car, it was somebody driving a car. Now we know that we can get autonomous vehicles because essentially we can predict somebody crossing the road, the curb, etc. When we look at healthcare, we needed a doctor, and a doctor would look at a bunch of x-rays. Now AI can take that data and reduce the cost of prediction. So issues that were predictive issues, which we knew about before, can get applied to AI. And then there's other areas in life that will become predictive issues. as the cost of AI falls and as we get more data. And so you've seen that with fintech, you've seen it with media tech, you've seen it with health tech. And so you can see how that then becomes much more important for the big issues in life, including climate change. And then I would look specifically at two levels. One is what I would call the individual asset level. So that might be how an asset is operating, and that could be an engine on a plane, it could be a battery optimization issue, it could be a number of different things. And then I would look at a systems issue and say how AI can help the system become more efficient. And with climate change happening, we are essentially needing to decarbonize, and therefore those systems are becoming much more interactive and much more interrelated. So you can't think about transport now without thinking about electricity, and you can't think of that without thinking about weather. And you can't think of that between farming. And so the systems are becoming much more collective, and yet AI can help us in a huge number of areas to add value. And so particularly when I look at the energy system, I would say we have spent billions of dollars on essentially hardware solutions, but we haven't yet applied the software solutions which allow that system to fully integrate. And so I do believe it can drive down carbon and reduce costs. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. And finally, Jay.
Paul makes a number of really good points about the increasing interconnectedness of systems, and I kind of suppose that would tie quite neatly then into a bit more about in my world, which is policymaking, which is concerned with as much of the whole system as possible. In a world of data-driven policymaking, I think AI for use in the public sector can be used to kind of responsibly inform our understanding of the implications of these whole system choices, which we would need to achieve net zero, as long as AI can explain why it made a certain decision that it did. One of the reasons climate change is such a complex problem is, of course, because it's such a complex system. I mean, Éliane, Paul, and David have already alluded to the kind of how AI can draw together data from all sorts of different sectors and domains and bring it into a kind of more coherent space when those barriers are removed. Typically, policymakers will usually pursue a combination of things like legislation and policy frameworks and research and development activities, behavior change initiatives, and these kinds of things to kind of tackle climate change in these discrete sectors or discrete areas of policy. While these aren't exactly unsuccessful methods, there is an increasing need to factor in a lot more of this at once and across domains. We've had a little bit of a think in the UK about how we might manage the impacts of AI responsibly in the public sector and direct the development of AI systems towards the most public benefit, with some guidance on responsible design and implementation of AI systems. But I think one thing I'm really excited about, and where AI could play a part more in the future in the public sector and policymaking, is in creating what we call synthetic environments, these digital representations of parts of our world, so that we can design better services, we can test interventions and develop new products in a much shorter span of time than you might otherwise, and without needing to dig up the road, so to speak. Could play across a number of areas of policy where it would require data to be drawn from multiple sources, and it would require things other than AI to be developed a bit further, but this is not AI acting on its own, but this is a scale of net zero challenge, I think, and a glimpse of how AI could support policy decisions in the future.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Thank you, all of you for kicking us off with that. Let's go into a bit more detail then. So David, could you tell us a bit more about the main ways that AI can help us with climate change mitigation and adaptation?
Absolutely. There are various overarching themes for how AI and machine learning can play a role in climate change strategies. The first one I'd like to touch on is in distilling actionable information for example, for policymakers from large amounts of unstructured data. This includes processing satellite imagery to pinpoint greenhouse gas emissions in real time, or to track deforestation, or to map infrastructure, like estimating the energy consumption of buildings, in order to guide policy decisions. The second theme is in forecasting. For example, forecasting agricultural yield, or predicting the supply and demand of electricity, which is an essential part of balancing power grids, especially as solar and wind energy become more prevalent, since the amount of sun and wind available at any given time varies. In addition to the demand, the supply is varying. Another theme is optimizing complex systems. Machine learning is very good at taking a complicated process like supply chain management, or the manufacture of steel and cement, which is responsible for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or even just heating and cooling a building, and turning the control knobs very carefully to make that process more energy efficient. There have been many cases where there have been huge efficiency gains just by sort of adding an AI-based control process on top of an existing complicated system. A fourth theme is fast approximations to physics-based models. For example, we know the physics of the climate, but climate models are still very slow to run because the equations are complicated. Machine learning can provide fast approximations to pieces of these models so that they run faster and make it possible to provide higher resolution climate or weather models, which are important for often local scale decision making. Or in other applications, you can also use these sort of faster versions of physics-based models like energy flow in buildings. And then finally, the final theme I'd like to touch on here is machine learning for speeding up the process of scientific innovation itself. For example, contexts like materials design for batteries or solar perovskites, where machine learning can suggest candidate materials or experimental parameters to try. It's not a replacement for experimentation. It's a tool to help guide it, so you don't have to spend as much time doing it, ideally. So climate change AI, one of the organizations that I help lead, released a big paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning that goes through these and other themes and details hundreds of specific applications of machine learning and AI and climate change mitigation, adaptation, and climate science. So I encourage anyone who's interested in more details to check that report out. There's also an interactive version of it if you don't want to wade through the full 100 pages. You can check that out on the Climate Change AI website.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And I've had a look at it and it is indeed really fascinating. So thank you for flagging that paper. Jay, what government policies and governance are needed to help us to harness the opportunities that AI presents for climate action?
Well, the answer is there's quite a lot. And especially in the run-up to COP26, we're seeing countries committing to a range of targets to end their contributions to climate change at a national level. But actually achieving those targets is going to be quite difficult, require a broad range of approaches and policies to set those parameters. There are quite a few policies to kind of that factor in here. Potentially, I think AI innovation is going to play an increasingly important role around the world, and institutions are going to need to adapt to country-specific constraints and conditions if they're going to also be able to support the communities they serve in this journey. But I think underpinning most of that is access to high quality, high volume, locally useful data. And on top of that, public trust and confidence in how data is used is also becoming an increasingly significant factor. What we've seen is a widespread, we've seen on the TV, widespread misuse of personal data that we see on the news around the world, which has resulted in quite a tenuous public trust in public and private sector data sharing, at least in the broad public consciousness. And on top of that, we've seen a concentration of power and market dominance, certain data practices from a few big tech players. What it's shown is entrenched public concern about data use even further, and it's inhibited data sharing and access in the public interest in some instances. I think there's a role for governments in figuring out the right kinds of data governance models to try to address this sort of environment. And promote the uptake of those models in new and interesting ways, for example, in applying themselves to issues around climate change. We've explored in the UK a model called data trusts as a model that could be it could improve access to data for AI technologies. What data trusts do in a nutshell is they create a vehicle for individuals to, like, everyone here, to state how they want their data to be used, and they tell a trustee to pursue these aspirations with their data on their behalf. It's a fairly flexible governance model on its own, but however you pursue data infrastructure and data mechanisms for sharing, policies and governance models to demonstrate the benefits of sharing data, including non-personal data, like how we've done with some pilot projects in illegal wildlife trade and food waste. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a crucial factor, a crucial policy that governments will have to consider when, if they want to start building AI and data technologies and ecosystems of AI and data technologies on top of those kinds of models to apply to cross-sector challenges like climate change.
Thank you, Jay. Éliane, we have 9 years left to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. How must climate change experts and AI experts collaborate effectively to help us to meet those goals?
So part of the dilemma we have is that we're late on most of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need an acceleration of this process. So we really need to pull insights from data a lot faster. And so that's why we really need a lot of Davids out there to help us in this endeavor. And at the same time, the reality is, in order for us to transform our systems, we need all forms of governance, of financial reporting, to look at not only produced capital, but natural capital and impacts on natural capital, on social capital and human capital. And so we need a lot more data to be looked at by governments, by public firms that are listed on stock exchanges. And we need those parameters to really take into how is the work they're doing affecting those other forms of capital. And so if we had systems that really brought all of those in, and that AI could help us gather all of that data and really be able to score how governments, how corporations, municipalities are doing at those levels, we could really be able to have guidance on how can we do better and faster. And that way we could all collectively have more insights to really help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks, Éliane. And then Paul, how can AI tackle climate change whilst also increasing prosperity and economic growth?
Yeah, so I think we have seen in the UK where we have managed to make great strides on decarbonisation, mainly through the generation source of electricity. So we have seen economic growth, but with decarbonisation happening. I think given the challenge we're seeing on a global basis, that people are going to have to move to a low carbon economy, and that is going to create new industries. And those new industries, we're seeing that with offshore wind, we're seeing that with electric vehicles, we're seeing that potentially with hydrogen. And as we've talked about already, those involve complex systems which require a lot of information and changes. So I do think there are a number of building blocks. I do think there is the data and data governance and access to data. I think above that is the concept of systems and digital twins. And then above that is the AI application of those. And so I think there is a huge capacity, if we can get hold of that data, to enable us to apply that data to run systems more efficiently, more economically, and to create the green jobs that we require. And you can boil that down to very simple things. So we know that there's a supply chain for creating offshore wind. We know offshore wind is incredibly important, but at the moment that's creating a lot more intermittent supply. The fact is that if we can do solar and we can do wind forecasting, that can reduce the cost significantly of balancing the grid, which is a cost to everybody. So that's just sort of one example. So I think there are huge numbers of examples that we can apply. And the other great thing about AI is that because you're dealing at the software level, the costs of actually implementing it aren't that high, but the benefits can be huge. And so if you think about the gigawatts of offshore wind we have, the ability to optimize that system only by small percentages can give hundreds of millions of benefits to balancing the grid. And so I think there is the capacity for new jobs, there's capacity for savings, and there's capacity for economic growth. But the winners are going to be the ones that can create the ecosystem, bring the data together, the governance together, and then can bring the talent together. And so that essentially that talent at the moment is being sucked off into fintech or media tech, and it needs to be sucked into the biggest issues that are most important to us, and that's climate change.
Thank you, Paul. That's really interesting. We're going to move into our second round of questions, and we're actually going to stay with you, Paul, for the first one. Could you give us one or two more examples of how AI applications or tools are already being used by industry to address the climate challenge?
Yeah, so to one of energy balancing of the system, I can think of a company called Habitat Energy, which uses AI machine learning to balance large lithium batteries into the grid, which helps balance the grid. There's another company called Open Climate Fix, which is using solar now forecasting to help the system forecast the solar yield, and therefore essentially to help balance the system. There is another company called Autonomy, which is using gas pressure management to balance the gas pressure, reduce leakage, and to increase biomethane injection, which again is decarbonizing. And then there's a lot in the satellite field as we're getting greater data. So that's about crop fertilization. And so what we're seeing is, first of all, we're seeing companies which are looking and saying, where can I get that data and where is it readily available? And then how can I prove and train the models and then monetize that quite quickly, and that becomes investable. The issue becomes is whether there are barriers in the markets or where that data is not freely available. And that's why we see the large push by the UK government for open data and energy. But already there are companies which are producing valuable insights and valuable economic growth. And really what we need is more data and more people looking at this space.
Thank you, Paul. Jay, can you tell us a bit more about how bilateral or multilateral cooperation is helping the development of AI in climate action?
Yeah, AI is becoming one of the most important topics, I think, in the digital economy. There are lots of international fora actually taking steps into this space, into AI more generally. There's an increasing number of people who are exploring guidance on, developing what we call responsible AI. You've got people like, off the top of my head, you've got the OECDs of the world and UNESCO, of course, the World Economic Forum, the Council of Europe, and many others. And as a natural extension of this kind of crowding into the AI international fora space, you've got the reach of topics in AI, which is also growing at a similar pace. And that includes coordinated work in areas that have got wide sectoral relevance, like climate change. So international cooperation is quite useful exercise. It's got many benefits, as it turns out. One of them is in contributing to and influencing the global narrative around, if you like, shared visions with like-minded countries. Other benefits can include bringing people together from different countries with different lessons learned in their own national contexts, which can then be shared with others to increase their understanding of a problem. But it can also signal to others in the wider ecosystem that these are things worth building transboundary structure around. And I suppose this is where people are starting to acknowledge in one breath, if you like, the alarming urgency of the climate crisis with the increasing implications of AI and its ubiquity. One thing that recently launched, I think, was, I think last year, was the Global Partnership on AI, which Canada is a founding member alongside the UK. And that's the first multilateral, multi-stakeholder forum to have a permanent focus on international cooperation in responsible AI. And it's looking at how AI technologies can tackle some of the world's biggest problems and help to potentially advance some of the targets in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned before. I believe they're looking to establish a subgroup on climate change and biodiversity to achieve some of the aims I just described. But there's also, away from that, there's also some great work going on with the Digital Nations group. It's a group of 10 leading digital governments who are attempting to break down thorny issues, including mandating energy and carbon transparency from the biggest players in the technology space, which would be, if unblockable, a worthwhile and an effective kind of mechanism to kind of figure out the size of the pie, if you like, which is of carbon emissions and its impact across wider supply chains, which is a very hard one to crack. Of course, there's only so much you can do at the multilateral level. I think at some point you're going to need to bring these learnings down to a local context, whether in specific barriers and hurdles in national context. I'm reminded often, for some reason, that I think it's in Denmark, they have a ministry for transport, building and housing in one ministry, which is great. How great is that to have such a kind of a connected portfolio in under one department? Other countries may not be so streamlined around certain policy portfolios. And sometimes there can even be difficulty getting two parts of one government to work collectively on the same goal. But international cooperation on big seismic issues like climate, as we're seeing, is an excellent way to send that signal back to capital, if you like, to start affecting change at home.
Brilliant, thanks, Jay. Éliane, one of the things the pandemic has shown us is that public health and planetary health are very much intertwined. How can AI help us to address the different facets of these complex societal problems?
So I think one of the interdependencies that COVID-19 has highlighted are really a reflection of the complexities we're dealing with and the importance of looking at planetary health and human health together. And so one of the things that we realize is that as we lose biodiversity in the world, well, we have greater chances of zoonosis, so infectious disease going from wild animals to humans being transmitted. And so part of it's how do you monitor all of these systems collectively together? How do you monitor what's happening all over the planet? And this is what I really love. Paul was talking about planetary twinning and the importance of being able to model the potential scenarios and how those different elements are interconnected. And so what's really important today is that there's a direct link between the fact that we've lost 60% of biodiversity in the last 100 years and the fact that we have greater and greater incidences of epidemics and pandemics. And so being able to bring all of this data together is very critical to our capacity to predict when will the next pandemic happen, because it will, if we don't find ways, as Jay was saying, to have more effective multilateral policy making that engages us collectively at all levels of government and corporate governance as well, because we are so at an age where corporate governance sometimes has greater influence than actual governance within countries. And so we need platforms that bring this all together so we can look at all of those drivers that influence the next pandemic and how they're linked to planetary health and our issues around being able to contain within planetary boundaries our production systems in ways that bring back nature, that enable us to really have strong human and social links while ensuring that we have systems that are really benefiting biodiversity preservation and hopefully bending the curve on the loss and bringing back biodiversity so we can create these buffer zones to ensure that we can stop this rate of accelerated pandemics and epidemics happening on the planet.
Thank you, Éliane. David, AI presents plenty of opportunities, but there are challenges with it as well. How can we best minimize the risks and maximize the benefits that AI presents as a tool in climate action?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there are a lot of different challenges here. The first that I can touch on is that AI is a very broadly applicable tool, and it doesn't have to be used for good. There are many applications of AI that are arguably making climate change worse, either directly by, for example, boosting oil and gas exploration and extraction, or potentially more subtly, like via advertising systems that are increasing global consumption, or could be doing so. Sometimes the impacts are quite complicated, for example, involving rebound effects or the Jevons paradox, like with self-driving cars. which are very good for public safety. They reduce road accidents, but they might end up being net bad for climate change if they lead to greater miles driven, if driving becomes cheaper and easier, even if self-driving techniques make the driving itself sort of more efficient in some cases per mile. So some of these impacts are very complicated to assess, and it really requires very careful domain knowledge to understand what the impact of some technologies is going to be. There's some concern about the power use of digital technologies, though AI is only one part of that. It's important here to remember that AI means a lot of different things. So there are very large AI algorithms that can use a lot of power, but most of the ones I use personally can run on a laptop. AI is a technological lever, and what it's being used for can have a vastly disproportionate effect, either good or bad, as compared to the direct power consumption itself. So I'm definitely most worried myself about negative applications, AI being used in negative applications. I'm also concerned about techno-solutionism, going in thinking that new technologies, fancy new AI ideas are going to save us. AI is useful in certain circumstances, but it's not going to solve climate change, and it's not the only part of any one of these things. It's something that can fit into existing strategies, which are in some cases being held back by bottlenecks that are amenable to AI, but one should never go in thinking that AI is the answer, and one should try to use the lowest tech possible solutions in any application. Sometimes one will need AI, and there are many situations in which AI can be useful, but going in sort of with a let's use technology and that will be our savior is not necessarily always going to lead to good results. And then the final negative or challenge that I want to highlight is just who controls the technologies and also the data. The set of players in AI is definitely very concentrated. It's easy to consolidate power and perpetuate various kinds of power imbalance across the world and within any particular country as well. And it's really important to make sure that these technologies are developed and deployed in a way that enhances the power of communities and many different stakeholders, rather than perpetuating a digital divide or really entrenching power in certain hands. Also thinking about where the data is coming from, because when you're training algorithms on data, the biases inherent in that data are going to be perpetuated, and really maybe more subtly there, who defines the problems. There are a lot of papers being written about wildfires, which are extremely important to work on. But there are fewer papers being written about locusts. That's not because locusts aren't important, but it's because they're important to parts of the world which have fewer people writing papers and forming startups. So just thinking about defining problems, controlling technologies, and controlling data. And I think that these are challenges that we can work through, but they are challenges very much.
Thank you, Dave. In a moment, we're going to go to a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to pop your questions into the chat. N'hésitez pas de poser votre question en français si vous le préférez. But before we do that, I'm just going to go to the panel one last time for a very quick fire round, very, very briefly. Please could you tell us what is your top takeaway that you'd like our audience to be left with today on the role of AI in tackling climate change? Let's start with Éliane, then Paul, Jay, and David. So Éliane, over to you.
So one of the realities we have is 80% of the biodiversity on the planet is in areas of the world where there are the most poor people. And so part of it is, how do we ensure that we have access to data and to experts that are addressing the issues that are critical to keeping our global biodiversity? And so we really need interaction between AI experts, between grassroots, between indigenous communities, so that we really have solutions that are going to help us to really bend the curve on biodiversity loss and allow climate adaptation and mitigation to be stewarded by the indigenous populations of the world that are the stewards of our biodiversity, critical to preservation of our climate. And so those are really important things for me.
Thank you. Paul.
So I think the energy system is ripe for change. and it's a hundreds of billions of dollar industry, which is very data rich, and I think has huge potential for significant benefits to carbon reduction. And so I would just be encouraging people on this call to get engaged and to be involved and to move the dial, because I think we need as many people as possible tackling the big issues, challenging the incumbents, and thinking about new ways of doing things. So it's an open call for all those people out there who are looking for challenges. Absolutely.
Jay.
Gosh, I mean, well, Éliane and Paul have, I think, hit the nail on the head there. One thing we see is a good lack of people with the right kinds of training in these domains to effectively translate across into other domains. So people who have a good grounding in machine learning or data science, who can understand the domain specifics of real world systems, like energy, as Paul was saying, which is itself a very technical field, and often have their own national contexts. You know, the energy system in the UK is different to the energy system in Canada and other parts of the world. So I would say, as well as becoming increasingly enabled by AI, those kinds of skills, those kinds of translation skills will be super important across a number of sectors, maybe all sectors, and will make those AI applications all the more effective. I'd encourage anyone who's inspired by that opportunity to consider how we can more effectively communicate between disciplines.
Fantastic. And David?
I would second what everybody else has said, and following up on what Jay was saying, I really think there's a huge need for intersection between lots of different areas, between expertise in different fields, but also between different stakeholders in different parts of the problem. And I would second the call for capacity building, people with knowledge of multiple areas at once. And I would also stress the need for just listening. I know that that's particularly an issue sometimes in the machine learning, AI, and tech community, really listening to people, making sure that the technologies are being deployed with a very careful understanding of what the problems are, and really designed to match those, and with careful understanding of the impact, because there are huge opportunities there, but we aren't going to leverage them unless we work together.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. So we're going to take a few questions from the audience. I'm going to start with a question that we've received live. So how can machine learning be used to select climate policies and forecast their impact? I think maybe one for you, Jay?
Yeah. How would we start with this? So AI, the number of ways AI could be applied to policymaking generally, as for their climate impact, there is, I'll start with a number of ways that AI could be applied to policymaking, and then quickly onto how to assess climate impact. Using advanced big data and natural language processing models are the kind of the go-to models to enable decision makers and policymakers to move beyond those conventional indicators and often expert discussions. There are, there are millions of scientific articles, market reports, and and patents out there on the internet, which can be very hard to for human policymakers to analyze in a good stretch of time, and you can use natural language processing or big data tools to help analyze, identify megatrends, or if you like, fading topics, and potentially provide predictive opportunities to look for, maps of, competencies, what we call weak signals, which are typically those future signals and those future emerging opportunities that don't have too many data points at the moment, that we could start to pinpoint and explore a bit more down. On measuring for climate impact, I mean, you can cut this a number of ways as well, of course. I think there's, we need to do a better job of measuring the carbon impact of every policy in government, and not just those in, let's say, the energy space. In fact, I think there's a term called non-energy policy, which is used to describe for example, policies that will impact the energy sector. Let's say, in transportation, electric vehicles, for example, and increasing the adoption of electric vehicles, but will then have kind of non-energy impacts. Sorry, they'll have impacts on the energy system nonetheless, even though they're not energy policy specifically. So, for example, like a much more unusual variation in energy demand, which would need to be matched. And so you can use NLP, you can use big data to address some of this policy problem. And I would argue looking for those policies across government that have the most effect on the issue of climate is probably the best place to look, not just in those areas that you think they would usually live.
Thanks, Jay. And Paul, you wanted to come in on this question as well.
Yeah, so I sit on the Fuel Poverty Committee for BEIS for the UK government, and so that it's a sort of classic example, essentially, of how we're trying to find people in fuel poverty and to target them with funding or with changes into the fabric of the building. And finding those people is incredibly expensive, actually. And actually, the more that you treat, the harder it is to find the rest of them. And so actually applying AI to that can reduce costs, can reduce carbon, and can make that a much more efficient position. And then you can tie into the health link to that to say, actually, if we could target those people who have bronchial chest infections and also live in damp homes, actually we have a double benefit. And then the next part I would add to that is that once you have those predictive models and you can find people or the search costs are reduced significantly, then you open up the policy remit for the government. The fact is the government can choose how it wants to allocate those funds because it can actually target. Whereas up until now, it hasn't been able to do that. So policy can help AI can help in a number of ways, including opening up that policy remit. So that's a very concrete example of something that's close to my heart.
Thank you very much. Someone has asked a question which kind of relates to the risks side of things that you were talking about, Dave, about the increased use of these AI algorithms to address climate change, the additional data, and then associated increased risks of cyber security threats and hacking. So how can we make use of this technology whilst also protecting ourselves against these specific risks? Do you want to respond to that, David?
Yeah, so I think that it's a big, complicated problem, and I don't know that I don't have an answer here. I will say that in some cases here, the data already exist, and they're in some cases not being held very carefully. So I would hark back to what Jay and others were saying about really having good procedures for managing, sharing, and working with data, because in some cases, not having those doesn't mean the data aren't being collected. It's just not being collected responsibly. But AI is definitely accelerating the demand for data, and therefore, to some extent, it is increasing the need for the data and the extent to which data is being collected. These protocols and steps to ensure security of data need to be implemented regardless of what it is being used to do. It's really a concern across society and digital technologies. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in here.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that one? If not, we can go to another question. We have quite a specific question. I'm not sure if anyone would be able to answer this in detail about building, construction, and how architects and engineers can use AI tools in their work, for example, to minimize carbon in the building supply chain. Paul, is that something you might be able to comment on?
Yes, there's a number of different levels of that, I guess. One is in the building management system, so in the sense of airflow, and you've seen that now where people are looking again at the use of buildings, and with COVID, people are deciding, well, how many days a week am I going to be in that building? How often do I want to heat that building? And so using AI and intelligent software and thermostats can help significantly in terms of carbon usage and the usage of that space. And then I think there is the design. So the design of the building and the building space. And again, understanding AI, the weather temperature, the temperature in the room, and mapping that across can affect design. And then finally, I think there's the whole construction. And we talk about modern methods of construction. And so how do you design and construct buildings which are low carbon? And again, all of that is about data and it's about efficiency. So lots of applicability, I think, in that space.
Thank you, Paul. We had another question about, I think many of you have referred to the multi-stakeholder nature of these problems and the need for different stakeholders to work together to address them. I mean, we can see on this panel, we have different constituencies represented: government, civil society, academia, business. How can we, what do we need to do to better foster increased multi-stakeholder collaboration in this area? I don't know who would like to respond. Éliane, perhaps?
So one of the things is the 21st century is really all about distributed leadership. And so part of it, that means we need to work across different stakeholders more and more. And this is about complexity. Everything we do is dealing with complexity. So it really requires a really diverse set of people at the table to be looking at problems and working at them together. However, one of the complexities that's added on is we need shared values that allow us to be aiming for something that we collectively want, that is of greater value to all of us than our individual values. Because one of the problems with multilateral discussions is everybody is trying to get what they want for themselves. And we need to, before we actually get to we need to define what is shared that is so important to all of us, that we're willing to let go some of our egoic desires so that we can get to the table and actually have discussions on how we can move together collectively. And this is critical in every single discussions we're going to have that relate to climate change and that relate to how we use AI effectively to allow us for better science-based decision-making in terms of policies, in terms of how do we ensure that investment field will encourage green technologies to be given more opportunities in terms of financing, while we decrease the opportunities for hydrocarbon investments or any type of subsidies that allow those industries to keep thriving. So we need to put in place systems that are really going to say, how are we going to create nature positive economies that bring all of us together and that ensure health for all and health for the planet?
Can I just build on that? I just think that's why this call is so important in the sense is that, you know, Canada and the UK have a shared history of working together on projects like this, where we have shared values, where we have shared desire to decarbonize, we have shared views on areas of bias and of data quality and of IP, and therefore there's a natural partnership here that is very strong, and the Canadians have done a huge amount already in AI that makes this a rich area to work together on.
And could I just add on a slightly more parochial point? The fact that we're doing this on Zoom and in the last year we've seen such an uptake and a cultural acceptance of virtual meetings has meant that governments, in my own experience, I've had far more conversations with a far more diverse group of people because of the accessibility, the pure accessibility of this. And that goes to a multi-stakeholder level as well, of course. You can cram in however many people into a virtual room to at least attend these discussions, if not participate, and find ways to participate in those discussions. And it has led to, in my anecdotal kind of experience, a far richer exchange of views. And I know David did an excellent workshop at NeurIPS, a big AI conference last November, that had a wide range of stakeholders, which I'll be honest, I've never seen before around a table talking about AI. And to me personally, it felt a bit like a watershed moment in that this is not only representative of the prominence that AI is gaining in communities around the world, and they feel an interest in and a need to engage in this topic, but there is the space for them to engage in as well. So that's me plugging virtual meetings and virtual conferences like this.
That seems to me to be a very uplifting and good place to draw our discussion to a close today. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. You were absolutely fantastic. It was a fascinating discussion and I think a really important discussion. Merci beaucoup à vous tous. Thank you also to everyone who joined today and for all of the great questions we received. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get through quite all of them. There's a lot of interest. Please do stay tuned to UK and Canada on social media for future events that we might hold either on AI or broader innovation topics or on climate change in the run-up to COP26. And thank you very much and goodbye. Merci beaucoup et au revoir. Thank you.